Sega's Mega CD, or Sega CD if you're in North America, and 32X consoles aren't exactly the most successful in Sega's lineup. The short lifespan and subsequent early demise of both systems resulted in them having relatively few games released for them, and also meant that many games in development were cancelled. Here we take a look at 15 of those many games. A Mega CD version of Capcom's awesome side-scrolling brawler Captain Commando was planned but never surfaced. A shame, as I think the Mega CD would have benefited from having some more ports of arcade beat-em-ups like Final Fight, which did of course come to the system. Captain Commando, like Final Fight, is set in Metro City and stars the titular Captain Commando, a superhero who fights crime with his 3 companions. Who knows if the Mega CD port was planned as a cut-down version, but considering the quality of the Mega CD's Final Fight port, no doubt it would have been pretty faithful to the arcade. Captain Commando was released in arcades in 1991 and didn't see a console port until the Super Nintendo in 1995. Since then, it's come to several systems, but sadly never a Sega console. Citizen X was a planned 1993 Sega Mega CD release from Digital Pictures, who made numerous FMV games for the Mega CD, including Sewer Shark, Double Switch and Night Trap. It's a side-scrolling action platformer with FMV cutscenes with less than inspiring looking gameplay. The FMV sequences are as grainy as you'd expect from a Mega CD game, with the typical cheesy acting for which Digital Pictures were known. Gameplay is at first glance reminiscent of Prince of Persia, but has far clunkier controls, and the levels themselves even look terribly grainy. In 2002, Good Deal Games released an almost completed beta of Citizen X. The fact that this was unreleased isn't that much of a loss really. The 32X had Virtua Fighter, it had Virtua Racing, but sadly we never got to see Virtua Hamster. Designed specifically for the 32X before moving to the Saturn when the 32X was a commercial disaster, Virtua Hamster was a 3D racing game wherein the player controls one of several rocket-propelled rodents through a course reminiscent of Sonic 2's special stages made from a hamster maze. There are reports that Sega disliked the use of the Virtua brand, so suggested renaming it to Virtual Hamster. That probably wouldn't have helped because people seem to say Virtual Fighter all the time anyway, so the association would have probably still been there. The Saturn development was also eventually cancelled, and in 2009 an early prototype of the 32X version emerged, in which one rodent, the titular hamster, is playable and no obstacles or opponents are present. The first of 2 cancelled LucasArts games on this list, Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, was a point-and-click adventure game and one of their most popular, being a fan favourite alongside the giants of the genre like Monkey Island and Day of the Tentacle. The game has an entirely original story written specifically for the game and was originally released in 1992 on Amiga, DOS, FM Towns and Mac, but never saw a console release. The following year, as was customary with LucasArts adventure games at the time, they released a CD-ROM talkie version with full voice acting, and it was this version that was to come to the Mega CD. Sadly, the Mega CD sales of The Secret of Monkey Island had been underwhelming, and so the Fate of Atlantis was cancelled. Jetski Rage was to be a single and multiplayer jet ski racer for the 32X, but unlike other jet ski games of the time, it was to have a first-person viewpoint. During development, the developers Velocity decided to add a fighting element to the game, presumably adding the Rage part of the title, featuring bounty hunters and deadly obstacles. I'm not sure how this would have worked, but road rash on jet skis instantly comes to mind. Some screenshots do exist from a French magazine which state a late 1995 release. Development moved to the Saturn when it was evident that the 32X was going nowhere fast, but neither version saw release. Burning Fists, which was also known as Force Striker in its early development, was a Mega CD fighting game in development in 1994. It was cancelled before completion, despite apparently lacking only the final boss and ending. 2 of the incomplete copies emerged on eBay when bought by a collector, before being sold to Good Deal Games, who finished the game themselves with the assistance of J2 Games. They released it on general sale in 2006. It actually looks surprisingly decent, with some vibrant colours and smooth looking gameplay. A pity, as the Mega CD could have done with some fighters. Another LucasArts point and click adventure that was planned for the Mega CD but was cancelled was Monkey Island 2 LeChuck's Revenge, my favourite LucasArts adventure and one of my all-time favourite games full stop for that matter. As with the fate of Atlantis, Monkey 2 was released only on home computers, the Amiga, DOS, FM Towns and Mac, but 1 year earlier in 1991. Cancelled for the same reason, the poor sales of its predecessor The Secret of Monkey Island on Mega CD, Monkey Island 2 wouldn't see a console port until 2010 with the release of the special editions. In 1993, rumours surfaced that Sega were working on an RPG called Sister Sonic, which would unsurprisingly star Sonic's sister. It was to be a reskinned and westernised version of Falcom's Popful Mail, which is a platform adventure game featuring RPG elements. This wouldn't have been the first time a Japanese game had been reskinned with a popular character for Western audiences. We saw it on the NES with the Western version of Super Mario Bros. 2, which was originally Doki Doki Panic. And yes, it's Brothers, not Super Mario Bros, you son of a bitch. Sonic, and more importantly Popful Mail fans, hated this idea and petitioned Sega to release a Western version of the original Japanese Popful Mail. The feedback was taken on board and Sister Sonic was scrapped, leading to Working Designs publishing an English version of Popful Mail on the Sega CD in North America. There really isn't much out there for this one, but a Castlevania game was in the works for the 32X. It was first announced in 1994 and has been dubbed Castlevania The Bloodletting due to a game of that name being advertised in a Konami brochure from a 1995 Consumer Electronics Show, but the developers have denied that the game for the 32X ever went by that name. It was to star Richter Belmont, Maria Renard and a playable rival character. Sprites of these three characters are all that are known to remain of the game, which were actually released by Konami themselves, so who knows if a demo or ROM will ever emerge. It was cancelled sometime in 1995 and the team went on to produce Symphony of the Night on PlayStation. Penn and Teller's Smoke and Mirrors was to be a 1995 Sega CD game based on the titular duo of magicians. It was an action platformer wherein the player controls Penn and Teller with a series of minigames which are basically wind-ups that the game's owner could use to fool their friends. Besides the platforming gameplay, the 5 available minigames were Desert Bus, perhaps the most infamous of the minigames given its recent iOS and Android re-release. The objective in Desert Bus was to drive a bus through the desert, and that's it, for 8 hours straight. The bus travels between Tucson and Las Vegas at a speed of 45 miles per hour, which in real time takes 8 hours, and the game cannot be paused, so you better hope that you don't need a piss. Very little control is needed, although the bus will naturally veer to the right, so the player must constantly keep the bus on the road. Once you reach Vegas, you can turn around and do it all again. Absolutely insane, although Penn did state that Desert Bus was the best part of the game. Mofo the Psychic Gorilla, this one's based on an act from Penn and Teller's stage show and basically involves the gorilla guessing player 2's card. Player 1 enters a code on the pad to tell the game which card player 2 has. This obviously requires the player 1 to have actually seen the card, so required a bit of practice, but there was, as with several of the minigames, a practice mode. Buzz Bombers was a 2-player arcade shooter wherein player 1 could enter codes on their pad to enable a series of cheats, ensuring that they always won. A code could also be input to switch the pad that controlled the cheats, in case player 2 got suspicious and asked to change controllers. Pressing all 3 buttons on the controller would reveal the prank to the poor sap controlling player 2. What's Your Sign would ask the player a series of random and quite absurd questions in order to guess their date of birth. The player's date of birth was quite simply entered by player 1 beforehand in a hidden menu. Scorcher was a Space Invaders-like minigame which spoofed 90s gaming buzzwords like blast processing and claimed to feature a technology called thermographics. Long story short, a disclaimer states that this technology can make the screen dangerous to touch, and an entered code will make the television screen display static to create the illusion that the game had broken the telly. The player was invited to also pretend that the screen had burnt their hand as an added wind-up for their mate. The reason that Smoke and Mirrors never saw release was simply that the console was dead by the time the game was actually finished, so they couldn't find anyone willing to publish it. Shadow of Atlantis, which was also known by the name Nautilus, was to be a point-and-click puzzle adventure game based on the novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Seemingly this was quite a big project, involving some of the teams that worked on Jurassic Park on the Mega CD and the aforementioned Virtua Hamster. It was to use pre-rendered 3D backgrounds in FMV in a manner similar to Myst. Before moving to the 32X, development began on the Mega CD and eventually moved to the Saturn, but was finally scrapped in 1997. Demo footage emerged, which cost a reported $70,000, and screenshots of Shadow of Atlantis were even on some of the 32X console boxes here in Europe, which makes it even more surprising that it was never released. Battletech Grey Death Legion was in development for both the Saturn and the Mega CD, although it's unknown how the two versions would have differed, if at all. Gameplay looks like a mech shooter, where the character's viewpoint is from a first-person perspective from within the mech, similar to that of Descent I suppose, although Battletech has ground-based movement as opposed to the 360-degree movement of Descent's ship. Not sure why this was cancelled, but a playable beta of the Mega CD version was leaked, and is available at Good Deal Games. An XMen game was planned for the 32X and was to be a console exclusive with a working title XMen Mind Games, and was shown at E3 in 1995. An early prototype was released in 2009, although in a very bare bones state. The only playable character is Bishop, although it indicates that Wolverine, Iceman and Rogue would have also been selectable in the final version. I've no idea why the game was cancelled, but more likely than not it was just the usual reason, the 32X was not doing well. Either way, I think the gameplay looks pretty uninspiring, and I'm not a fan of this graphical style at all. A 2D side-scrolling X-Men game would have been much better. I bet you're sitting there watching this video and thinking that your life is complete. Well, not when I tell you what you've been missing all these years. An MC Hammer video game. That's right, the Hammer was to have his own game on the Mega CD, with the suitably ridiculous name Hammer vs Evil D in Soulfire. I actually know hardly anything about this game, I'm afraid, but I just had to give it a mention, and all that remains is this short gameplay clip. For whatever reason it was cancelled, so you quite literally can't touch this. Of all the cancelled Mega CD and 32X games, and probably from any system ever for that matter, Alien vs Predator hurts the most. This is up there with Cadillacs and Dinosaurs as one of my all-time favourite arcade games, and it's criminal that neither got ported to a console. I always say that they'd be right at home on the Saturn, especially seeing as Capcom were huge supporters of the Saturn, but I would have settled for a 32X port of Alien vs Predator. Capcom announced in the summer of 1994 that it was coming to the 32X, but was cancelled the following year along with the aforementioned Mega CD port of Captain Commando. A version did come to the SNES, which was also a side-scrolling beat-em-up, but nowhere near the quality of the arcade version. I'm gutted this never came to one of Sega's 32-bit consoles, and it's one of the most beautiful, fun side-scrolling beat-em-ups out there, and it's aged really well, so I'd recommend checking it out on MAME. So those were 15 of the many cancelled Sega Mega CD and 32X games. Let me know in the comments which ones you wish had seen release, and those that you think are better off dead. Thanks for watching.